or Ambassador Wouters, maybe you would like to start. What are the key challenges facing Europe and the EU? What are the key issues facing voters? And if I could just ask a follow-on to that, are those the same thing, right? So we hear a lot about immigration, the rise of populism, youth unemployment. Are the issues that voters worry about the same as the issues that European leaders are worrying about?
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for having us. I think the things that resonate with the voters in Europe are very much the same things that, or the issues that resonate also here in the United States. So we can really compare. And I often say a lot has to do with security, but in a very wide sense, security. It's you can also call it a call for protection in a wider sense. So to have a secure job and with a good salary, that's what people. And then when they get a bit older, to have a quality in their life and accessible, affordable healthcare, possibly based on free choice. Three, that's of course they're concerned about sending children to the best schools possible, best universities possible, to buy a house at affordable price. So these are still the things that really resonate, and I think overall that is what I think most politicians at national and local level are still working on in the first place. Now, you mentioned also the big challenges for the European Union, and there I would start by saying that in order to understand these challenges, one has to know what were the promises when the European Union were created. What was promised to the people? And the promises were threefold, I think. There was an economic promise, there was a political promise, and there was a security promise. The economic promise was, of course, in the first place, the custom union that became then the single market, and then for 19 out of the 28 member states, the single currency. The political promise was about democracy and freedom, and we all know from modern history what that Spain, Portugal, Greece, they chose for democracy after having lived through other periods. Eastern Germany and then the other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, they joined also the European Union because they wanted to be part of the economic and the political promise. And then the security promise was about internal, external security, stability. Now, what happened in the last 10 years is that these promises proved to be vulnerable. 10 years ago, economic and, 2008, 2009, economic and financial crisis shook the promise of economic prosperity, welfare, and so on. I still remember when I was working for the Belgian Prime Minister in 2009, we were calculating that the Belgian economy and the loss for the individual citizen in our country, my country, potentially could amount to 25% purchasing power loss, because 25% was more or less the potential maximum loss to the economy. Until today, a lot of the problems that the young people are talking about, without necessarily naming it, go back to that 25% loss of purchasing power. So it's still, I think, an issue, an underlying issue, I would say. And then, with of course, the political promise was proved to be vulnerable with different issues. Migration was certainly an issue because there was an underlying feeling with the people that they might lose part of their identity and maybe also part of their prosperity and maybe even also security. So, and of course the promise of security was heavily shaken by all the attacks. I mean, London, Barcelona, Paris, Brussels, these are all names that still stick in our minds. And then on top of that came the crisis with Russia, annexation of territory in the immediate neighborhood of Europe. And also, I would add, a crisis of the values, especially in countries like Hungary and Poland, the rule of law. So there's enough on the challenges on the plate, I think, if you add it all up. And but probably, and you're right to mention migration. The migration one is probably the most, or the challenge with the most risk because of the narrative that goes with the migration, with the possible narrative. Because if you have in the political class, in whatever country it is, politicians who speak to the people in terms of you're going to lose your prosperity, you're going to lose your identity, you're going to lose your security because of migration, then of course this is a powerful narrative today in Europe for fearmongers, and I will stop here. For those parties that are the parties in Europe that traditionally support, defend, promote the European Union, they have to adjust, of course, their action and to show that they also can be energetic and effective in tackling the migration issue, to which maybe we can come back later. But I will stop here.
No, we will come back there later. And not to go back on my promise to let you both answer this one, but because you mentioned the narrative of migration, Ambassador Schubert, I did want to ask you, this is a narrative that we've also seen obviously take hold here in the United States. I think it was last week, although time passes these days, that the U.S. president tweeted, "We don't want to be like Germany. Crime is way up, despite the fact that crime is at the lowest rate since I think 1992 in Germany." So, and that's not a partisan statement, right? That's a statement of fact. So, obviously, and we've all seen the photos of Trump and Chancellor Merkel and the story that he threw starburst at her. So I guess my question is, if we're talking about challenges on the plate, has the transatlantic relationship fundamentally changed, right? Is the way that the transatlantic relationship operating now, is that a new challenge? Or are we exacerbating, are we just magnifying differences that were already there?
It's difficult to give a singular answer to that. I think starting with your second part, there have always been certain differences. And I think we haven't picked up also in Europe on the signs that they were there. I was present when Bob Gates held his famous speech in the Solvay library about the security of Europe and basically warning Europe, I'm leaving now and I'm the last one of a group of people who still has a connection, a real connection with Europe. Guys, be careful, when I'm out, there will be a different class of people, a different age group of people who will be ruling in Washington, and you will have a different dialogue with them. So we haven't picked up on a number of signs. I think one, security. It is amazing, and I must say a great gift, that more than 70 years after the Second World War, the United States is still present with large numbers of military personnel in Europe. It's very important for Europe, and but it has also given us a certain sense of security, which has lulled us more or less into complacency. So I think that, and maybe you needed a person like Donald Trump to wake us up and say, guys, this is not going on forever. I think that the difficulty in Europe at the moment is, on the one hand, we would like, and I think it is essential for us to keep that transatlantic relationship and this military cooperation in place. On the other hand, we have to strengthen our European military possibilities for maybe the day that the United States will no longer be there, or to fulfill our obligations to the alliance. I say fulfill your obligation to the alliance, and not for the day that the Americans will no longer be there. But okay, there are some people who see that like that. Secondly, on the trade issue. There is, let's phrase this carefully, but make America great again doesn't mean that the United States have to go back to a range of products on offering from the time that America was great again. I think that President Trump is very much focused on production of traditional products. In that field, yes, there is a large surplus on the European side. On the other hand, if you look at the new economy, if you look at the service economy, if you look at Silicon Valley, etc., there's a large surplus on the American side. If I were a betting man, I would basically say, you know what, I'm more interested in that new economy, that Silicon Valley economy, than that I am in a steel factory or somebody who makes whatever, wooden cupboards. However, basically what is happening now, we are being held against the measure of the traditional product line, and yes, in that field, we in Europe have a surplus. On the other hand, the benefit for the United States of having the currency of the dollar, which is the currency, which is our reserve currency for everybody, is a huge benefit, and there are a number of other benefits for the United States. So what I am worried about is that for the idea that we have to balance our trade, which I think is impossible on a one-on-one situation. The balance of trade is worldwide, and you will win some on this continent and you will lose some on the other continent. Not taking into account that I think the main spoiler on the international trade field is China. Thirdly, that I think we have a window at the moment, a window of opportunity to regulate the new economy. And that window, in my view, is 10 or 15 years. And if we do not take that opportunity to regulate the new economy now, somebody else will do it for us, and that somebody might not have the same set of standards and values that we have. I think the transatlantic relations, therefore, in the trade field is essential. We have to stick together to basically reshape the new economy in ways that are acceptable to us. And that's not, so one don't want to be politically incorrect, and I don't want to attack, let's say, Asia or whatever. But I think it's very, very important that at this point in time, we come together and we will come to an understanding how we think the new economy would look like we did 70 years ago, and to throw out all the international trade arrangements that we made 70 years ago, where the United States was the leading instigator of this field, of these ideas, and that has served us extremely well over the past 70 years, I think is a real pity. Lastly, and one quick point on immigration. Like Dirk said, it's a big sticking point in Europe. The refugee problem as a whole is an enormous global sticking point. It's more than 60 million people are on the move, internally and externally. I have to say that the United States on the refugee part doesn't carry its weight. We have to come to a global division of who is taking in those truly refugees, which we have all signed up for, because we have signed all the refugee treaties that are to assign. And I think we have to come to a common understanding globally who is carrying the weight of the refugees. If not, if you have more than 1 million refugees in Jordan and 3 million in Turkey, and I don't know, 1 million in Lebanon, that's a very explosive situation. If we cannot handle that situation, you are basically raising the next generation of people who are very angry at the West, and I must say, have a reason to be very, very angry with us. You had the possibilities and the money to help us, you didn't. So I think that is also something that we have to do.
We are going to come back to the question of migration, but I just want to, before we leave trade, ask one follow-up, which is, how do Europeans understand trade? By which I mean, is there a unified European understanding of the U.S.-European trade dispute? You know, on the one hand, you have Donald Tusk saying in a speech, like, if you need a helping hand, there's one at the end of your arm, like, Europeans will come together and will be unified on trade. But on the other hand, there are so many other divisions in the EU that, as an American, one wonders, is this going to be the thing that they can really put aside their differences and come together on?
Yeah, well, I think on trade there is what's happening here with the trade policy, with new development in the trade policy, is something that resonates, but not in a very positive manner in Europe. So and on that resonance, I think there is sufficient common understanding in Europe that it's not the direction that Europe wants to go, globally speaking. I mean, in terms of overall direction, I think that the economies in Europe are too dependent on import and export of goods and services in order not to have, let's say, a very open look on the rest of the world. And by the way, if you see at what the trade agenda that is rolling out in Europe, what it looks like, it is about going from more or less covering 40-45% of world economy through trade agreements towards 60 and even a bit more than 60% of the world economy. So that's going on at the moment. And just to give you a sense of direction, now it is also from the economic point of view, there is not much understanding of protection. Protectionism is not the way that Europe wants to go. That Ambassador Schubert mentioned trade balances. I mean, we in Europe, I think we understand that trade balances are not the result of trade negotiations or tariff negotiations. They are the result of other economic factors. We know the potential risks of the trade tensions, and I agree that at this moment, while we are speaking, and we're looking at the volumes, for example, that are involved in steel and aluminum, it's still rather limited, and we're only in the skirmishes, as they say. But there are, of course, serious risks, and the tit for tat thing, the link between security and trade, is not without risk. And also that whatever one thinks about WTO, which is in need of some reform, that's not disputed in Europe. I mean, to completely undermine it while we're still winning cases against China would be a big mistake. So I think when it comes to trade in Europe, they would have hoped, and they were thinking that could be part of the solution, looking at the excess capacity that China is producing on the world market. And suddenly they became part of the problem in Europe. So now, will we be in the reaction united until the end? Oh, that is a prediction I cannot make. It's clear that there will be a discussion, which is already ongoing, on how this could possibly end. And I think now on the first package of measures, balancing measures that Europe has taken, I think there is sufficient unity. But again, it's a balanced reaction, dollar for dollar, and it's measured, not giving it too much publicity, not speaking out too loudly, certainly. But then, when it comes to other sectors that might be protected here on the market, like cars or agriculture or the space industry or the air industry, then I think the debate might become a bit more difficult in Europe, and we'll see. But that it will damage the that it could potentially damage the economy on both sides. So that's very well understood. I mean, today it's still a tariff of 10% or 20%. On orange juice for the European consumer. I mean, it's excellent orange juice that's coming from Florida and other parts of the United States. But I mean, they can also switch to the Spanish orange juice, the consumer. But for if they want, but for the business leaders, they will have to make an assessment. I think in Europe whether they kind of make a pause on their investment plans, including in the United States because of the uncertainty, or whether they go full speed ahead and invest much more in the United States on the territory of the United States. And I think the jury is still out on that choice.
Mm-hmm. Not to be quite American about this and force this part of the conversation to go in a positive note, but Ambassador Schuver, what can be done in your mind to increase cooperation between the United States and Europe, right? Because I don't think anyone's at a point, it doesn't sound like you two are at a point where you're sort of like, that's it, gonna go find a new ally, it was fun, we had a good run. So what can be done to sort of get the transatlantic relationship back on track?
Yeah, well, I think you're talking to the two right ambassadors. I say Belgium and the Netherlands, we live off international trade. Both countries have more than 50% of our national income comes from international trade. So we are very, very worried. And as Dirk said, this can turn into what Barbara Tuchman wrote a book about, the March of Folly. You know that you're on the wrong path, and you still feel obliged because your opponent does one that you have to do the next step, etc., etc. Nobody is able to break that chain. So I think I'm very, very, or we are very, very worried about it. What can we do? On the positive side, on trade, I think we have to remember that when we were in the TTIP negotiations, and they were broken off in the end, something like 80 to 85% of what was being discussed was basically agreed on. So there is what we would call low-hanging fruit there, which you might start to identify and might start to balance out. There are things that are more agreeable to the United States than to the EU, but there must be a smaller package can be made where you say, you know what, you have a first positive step. Things like mutual recognition, a lot of the standards do not in pharmaceuticals test twice, etc. There are those very simple things that I think can be done where both sides will say, well, you know what, nobody will object to that, without touching on the much more difficult ones, which are agriculture or government procurement. Let's leave that at the side. And without those things, there are still a heck of a lot of things that we agree on and which would be very beneficial for both economies. And we would show both our sides of the Atlantic we are willing to cooperate and invest in that mutual beneficial relationship. Yeah.
My last question before we open it up to the questions from the audience. Almost every answer that you've given this morning has somehow touched on migration. The migrant flow into Europe is not what it was in 2015. It is significantly lower than that. And yet it's now that you have Merkel's coalition partner, the CSU, threatening to leave over the migration issue. It's now that you have Hungary making it illegal for NGOs to even help asylum seekers, right? It's now that you have the rhetoric sort of heating back up. Do European leaders understand the cause and reality of the migrant crisis, the migration crisis, the influx of migrants and refugees in the same way as their populations? And if not, how do you close that gap?
Well, I can try. I think there is a relatively good understanding by the political class in Europe about the migrants. I mean, when you meet European politicians, you know that whether they're in parliament or they have the function of a mayor or they're a cabinet minister, in all these different functions, and also when they negotiate at European level, they come across the problem. They are faced with a problem. They have to find houses, new space. It's so I think that they are very much familiar with the migration, with the challenge of migration. But second, I think that the causes or the deep root causes of migration, they are very well known by the large public. I mean, they know it's about the instability in the Middle East and North Africa. I mean, some decisions have been taken in the past about interventionism without follow-up, and so people got on the move. Ambassador Schur mentioned the numbers, so they know that. I think they also have a good sense of the mechanisms that are behind these especially the irregular migration. I mean, they know that the traffickers and the bad people, let's say, they operate like a business, and they can adjust the routes, migration routes, according to the decisions that are taken locally, nationally. I mean, so they do it very, very fast. So overall, I think they have a good. But of course, probably if there is a gap between the expectation of the citizen and the political class, it's because we in the search for European solution now for 2 or 3 years, we have not yet been able to square a certain circle. Well, a circle of 3 elements is a bit of contradiction, but the first, I think, is that we have been looking for a more equitable spread of the burden of hosting refugees. And there we came across a strong resistance from mainly Central and Eastern European countries, which was by the countries like Sweden, Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, let's say more on the western side of Europe, was badly taken because these were countries that during the Cold War and the uprisings for example, in Hungary, but also elsewhere, were very generous in hosting their refugees. So they had expected a bit more return this time to share the burden. Second element that is on which one has to find a solution is that there is in the rule book one basic rule, and that is that the country of first entry is responsible for the registration and the handling of the request by the arriving refugee. We call it technically the Dublin regulation in Europe. And that, of course, puts a heavy burden on the countries who are geographically in the south of Europe, mainly Italy, but also Greece, and at a certain time was Spain. And the third element on which one has to find at political level, and that is what do we do with the spoilers, those who do not participate in a common solution. I mean, not forget that countries like the Netherlands and Belgium at the national level, they have found solutions to manage in not ineffective way, I would even say an effective way, and at a good speed. The migration problem and the refugee problem. I mean, but we adopted national plans for spreading around, and all the mayors, all the cities, and all the villages that were participating, the north, the south, the east of the countries, they were participating in a distribution plan, and it worked. It worked, I think. So, but we have not been able to do this at the European level. So it doesn't go fast enough, and I think that also the mini summit of last weekend proved that there are still stumbling blocks, And in the meantime, we have to scale up, probably also much faster, the implementation of our European Coast and Border Guard, which the idea is to move up, at least as last proposed, to move 10,000 with a budget of 18 billion euros. So it's quite well. It's not yet the American Coast Guard, but it's still. If we can do this, I think that this will certainly respond to a need that is felt by the people. Because if you don't know who's on your territory, your European territory, you have no real starting point to manage whatever problem related to refugees and irregular migration. Thank you.
Can I add
Yeah, of course.
one thing, which is, let's say, call it the politics of fear. I remember that in my country, we have a right-wing populist party headed by Mr. Wilders. And Mr. Wilders gained the majority of votes in a village in the north of my country, Volendam. And they went to the village and said, "Why did you vote for Mr. Wilders?" And they said, "Because of the problem of the Muslims. And Mr. Wilders doesn't want to have the Muslims, and we voted for Mr. Wilders because of the problems of the Muslims." And then they went to the registry and they found out that there were 2 Muslims living in Volendam. So they went back to the same person and said, "Well, that's interesting, but there are only 2 Muslims living in Volendam, so what is your problem?" And the answer, of course, is, if we don't vote for Mr. Wilders, all the Muslims will come here because we are a prosperous society, and they will all settle here. That's exactly the same reasoning that Orban has for Hungary, etc., etc. They do not have refugees, or hardly any refugees. I think they're in the 60s, 70s. But their reasoning is, if we do not defend our borders, we don't put up walls, and we do not defend our position in Europe, they will come. The fact is that if they come, and Dirk already alluded to it, we had 65,000 refugees coming in the Netherlands in 2015 without any problem. Of course, without any problem is too much, but we have accommodated them. They are 2 years later, 3 years later, they're integrated in our villages. Some of them have returned, and quite a lot have returned, and the others have started working in the villages. We are a densely populated country, 17 million on the size of Maryland. We can still accommodate them with a bit of goodwill. And actually, I think a lot of the churches and so on, you see, they step up at that moment and say, "You know what, it's our Christian duty to help you." And so we have accommodated them. So if they come, I think even in rather large numbers, look at Sweden, 170,000 in 2015, 2% of the population. To put that in perspective, that would be 7 million people here in this country. In 1 year came to Sweden. They have accommodated them. So you can.
Just a very small, to pick up on the good, this interesting story about Volendam, this village. Just at the European level, in 2015, the famous crossings between Turkey and Greece, 10,000 a day. 10,000 a day. Today, there was an agreement with Turkey, 81 per day. So it is possible to manage it in a reasonable way, I would say, a responsible way. So, but it's more, I think you're right, it's less a migration crisis at the moment, and it's more a political crisis in certain countries. Thank you.
Okay, we will move now to questions. We have 36 minutes. I think we'll take them in 2 or 3. If you could say your name before you ask your question, and if, I know it's Washington, but if your question could be a question. We'll start with the gentleman. We'll start with the gentleman at the back table.
Dan Maffei, I'm a former member from New York. I also sit on the Federal Maritime Commission, the other FMC. And what you said about trade in your country is absolutely true. Rotterdam being the number 1 and Antwerp being the number 2 ports in Europe. You guys can argue about that. The point that Ambassador Schwer made about Trump maybe, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I'm paraphrasing, Trump may be having a point that America's NATO commitments have been maybe taken for granted a bit. Is the same thing true about trade? In Germany, which has the third largest port, there have been some folks who have said, wait a minute here, there is some asymmetry in the way American goods are kept. I'm wondering if, given how important trade is in your countries, whether your governments have put some pressure on the EU to say, okay, Trump administration does have a point, let's negotiate some of this.
A provocative first question. I saw two hands up here toward the front. So you and then you, yes.
Two questions, I'll make them short, but on immigration, it seems like...
Sorry, your name, please?
Oh, sorry, Russ Carnahan, former member from St. Louis. A lot of the immigration debate is about whether to accept or decline immigrants, and there seems to be very little focus on what to do about the source of the immigration, the conflicts, the hunger, and what can allies in the international community to do about that, to stem the immigration. Secondly, what are your countries doing about diversifying your relationship with the United States, given the president we have now, to governors, mayors, companies, and how are you dealing with that?
And then you.
Bob Clement, former congressman, Nashville, Tennessee, country music, USA. Ambassador, it's great to have you all here. Very informative too. And, a number of us are worried about Mr. Trump's statement and how it's coming across overseas, knowing EU and NATO are so critically important to the United States and Europe and the world. And where are we now? And I know Ambassador Sherry made Mr. Trump a wake-up call. I'm sure it is a wake-up call, but that unity has been so important to us. What's going to happen now, particularly with EU in trouble?
Yeah.
And about its future.
Okay, we'll stop there for this round. We'll do another round after this. So we have, does Trump have a point about trade as he did about European defense? What are we doing about the source of the immigration, of immigration really? What are we doing about diversifying the relationship between, so that it's not just head of state to head of state? And then where are we now with transatlantic unity? I will let you divvy that up as you see fit. But Ambassador Shuva, maybe we'll start with you.
Shall we do 2-2?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, well,
Which two?
let's do.
Well, whichever two he doesn't take, you're stuck with.
Well, let me do 1 and 4, and you do 2 and 3. Yeah. Okay. And I'm sure you also want to say something, especially on one. The symmetry on trade. Yes, there are the famous symmetry, of course, which has been cited very often, is the 10% tax on cars. Which has not been said is that there are 25% tax on the US side on SUVs and pickups. The three most popular cars in the United States are SUV and pickups. The three most popular cars in Europe are compact and mini cars. I think that is the main problem. We drive a different. I don't know. The first time I was in the United States, I was for 3 years in Los Angeles, and I was young and foolish and took a canary yellow Cadillac from 1978 with me back home to the Netherlands. I couldn't park it anywhere. There are no parking slots available for a 1978 Cadillac, I can tell you, because you drive a different type of car than we do. Yes, there are asymmetries. Yes, I think we can work on them. I'm pretty sure that the Germans are looking at it. But then also, you know what? If we say we go down with our 10% on passenger cars, what will the United States do on SUVs and other cars? will not make an enormous difference because we don't make pickup trucks in Europe, or hardly any. So you will not be flooded by Mercedes-Benz pickup trucks because they do not exist. And I do not think that anybody in Amsterdam living on the canals will buy a big Lincoln or whatever because he cannot park. So I think that it's also a little bit for show. But I think there are certain asymmetries, and I think we will be willing in the end to look on an equitable solution where both sides give a little bit. You want to do something on that?
On trade, I mean,
Yeah.
there's no, I think, not a lot of, how do I say, of sympathy at the moment for the two strong beliefs that we notice here in the diplomatic community. Is one that the trade relationship with Europe is too beneficial for Europe. I mean, if you look, as I showed, investment, there's more European investment in the United States than was there. Ambassador Schubert said about service economy. My country has a deficit with the United States, which is very helpful these days, trade deficit in goods. I don't know, the Netherlands?
My country too, a huge trade deficit.
A huge trade deficit.
deficit.
Not guilty,
Yeah,
but not guilty.
Yeah.
So this is, and the 28 or 29, in fact, also the EU ambassadors, they did a couple of days ago an opinion article in the Washington Post to explain that, I mean, it is the trade relationship is one that benefits also the United States. And on the second thing that where I think Europe has a bit of a different analysis is that the present world order, if you look it on balance, whereas we hear here that it produces more cost and benefits for the United States. I mean, we still tend to believe that it is still a world order that is more beneficial to the West globally. And by the way, EU is part of that world order because it's based on also on rule of law, certain rules, working together, peace and so on, economic prosperity. So on these two issues, I think there is a slightly different look at the moment, you know. But these are issues that resonate also. I mean, things can resonate also because they're not necessarily positive. They're negative can also resonate. That's what I want to say.
Well, since it's come to the point where we have ambassadors writing explanatory op-eds in the Washington Post, you know, that goes to this idea of how are you diversifying the relationship, right? You're clearly trying to go directly to the people. I know on climate change and the Paris Agreement in particular, especially Western European governments were very frank about the fact that they were reaching out to mayors and businesses and heads of state. Have you seen sort of an increase in, as the gentleman says, diversification in your relationship with U.S. leaders?
Yeah. I think today, I mean, I'm speaking very openly and honestly, it is for ambassadors like countries that we represent here and for others, it has become even more important to be an ambassador to the United States and not just to Washington. And I think that indeed there is overall much more reaching out to Congress. We spend much more, sometimes together. Yeah. We spend more time in Congress. I think we go more often to the authorities in the individual states. Governors, mayors were mentioned. I mean, and sometimes they tell us, yes, we feel close with you, and maybe closer with you than now with Washington at the moment. So there is much more of that outreaching, and also I think what is a bit changing because for some of us the job, the function is changing, I think. And public diplomacy, I mean, we speak probably more to young people, universities in the country, to manufacturers, to workers, and you can even further switch or adjust your outreach. You can go to also to churches and try to really understand what's going on in the country. So yes, there is a shift going on, I think, quite honestly, because you want to know what are the deeper developments that are going on in the society.
Yeah, and then since you also said that you would take question 2, what is this? Is there, when the EU has these mini summits on immigration, is there also discussion on what to do about the source of the immigration, or is it more focused on internal movement and quotas and who's taking who and which coalitions are falling apart?
Well, the deep roots of migration, I mean, they're linked to the conflict. I mean, in Syria, but in Syria we know there's no military solution, probably. I mean, the position in Europe is it's only the political process that will help us out of this situation. I mean, Iraq, Afghanistan, it's very much today about stabilization, in which Europe is involved. In Africa, where you have probably the biggest origin of irregular migration route to Europe. Don't forget that geographically we are really very close, and the Mediterranean is a small sea after all. It's a narrow sea. There is increasing number of European operations that try to stabilize, whether it is the EU, NATO, or UN framework, that try to stabilize situations. Mali is an example. But there are also bilateral operations like missions like Niger, but it's not it's probably not enough to stem or to prevent people from fleeing their countries, mainly for economic reasons, and often unfortunately getting into the hands of traffickers and smugglers. But things have happened. I mean, the Italians and together with the help of Europe, they have done done a deal with Libya. There are deals with Niger. There are more than 20 agreements now in the last 2 years of readmission. So that you ask an African country, you give them some money also. That's the Spanish model. You know how Spain resolved its migration or immigration challenge 18 years ago. There was a famous Western Mediterranean route. It was the one going through Spain and they used large parts of their development cooperation money bilaterally to kind of, if I may say, quote unquote, pay off the African partners to keep the migrants home. Mm-hmm. And they were quite effective, but because if you look at the figures, they're quite dropped almost to zero. Today it's going up again recently this year, but starting from a very low base. There is, I think that I also have to mention the large solidarity, but mainly financially, but also humanitarian, with those countries in the Middle East that are taking a lot of refugees and keeping them in their country. It's like Lebanon, Jordan, and they get huge European aid for what they're doing there, humanitarian. But I mean, it's we're talking about millions of people, millions of refugees. So it's very significant, and these are all potential migrants or refugees for Europe itself. So yes, something is done. There is some solidarity to tackle the source, but again, the numbers are so overwhelming, especially those who are ready to come from the sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, the numbers are really big.
And then, Ambassador Schubert, to get to the last question, what's the status of European-American unity? Or to put it in maybe a darker way, can we still say at this point in time that there is unity?
Right. Let me answer it a little bit along the lines of NATO. I was for 3 years, I was the Chief of Staff of the Secretary General of NATO, so I'm following this very closely, and we are running up to the NATO summit in 2 weeks' time, which will be an important summit. There's a question. There are two questions on the policy of the United States administration at the moment, which is one is if you have a transactional policy, can you still have allies? Because the thing about allies is that you do something for your ally, even if there is not a gift coming back. You do something for your ally because he's an ally. That has been already in the campaign, that has been questioned by the president, who basically said, well, the NATO is obsolete, and if these guys don't pay in to a certain amount, you know what, we will more or less cut them loose. I think that is very important. I immediately have to add that has been rescinded. There are other people who have spoken, and the fact of the matter is actually that last year the United States invested heavily in Europe to the tune, I think, of all in all accumulated $7.5 billion, actually more than they ever did before. But the essence of Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, an attack on one of us will be an attack on us all. The essence of that is that it is believed by the other side and therefore will never be tested. Because God forbid that somebody says, well, you know what, I'm going to poke the bear a little bit and see what happens. We don't want, nobody of us wants to be in that situation, so it's essential that everybody is convinced of the fact that if you poke the bear, the reaction will be swift and massive. And that is in doubt. That is in doubt especially by our friends on the eastern side of the NATO border. If you are in Estonia or one of the Baltic states, you have reason, with a large Russian minority in some of them, you have reason to be worried. The second thing is that from time to time the president seems to adopt a policy of keep them guessing. I am unpredictable. If you are the most powerful country in the world and still the country on which a lot of sort of stability in the world depends, I think the world wants you to be dependable. Please be dependable. And therefore a strategy of independence, of not being dependable, is something that worries a lot of us. Please be dependable so that we know that we always have an ally in Washington. That's not always the case.
Okay, I think we have time for 3 more, so we'll go to the woman in the red dress first. Yes.
Shirley Floyd, Steve Guardi, wife of Congressman Jody Guardi, and Balkan Affairs Advisor to the Albanian American Civic League. I think both ambassadors have spoken about the problem of equitable sharing burden in this refugee crisis with Eastern and Central European leaders, at least some, not willing to share the burden. But for those of us in the United States, many of us are deeply concerned about the United States not sharing the burden. And perhaps it has been expressed in your press, but we haven't seen it in English language press, that the EU is coming together to challenge the U.S. And ask that we accept a huge number of the refugees coming in. Is that in the cards? Can that happen?
Let's take, yes?
It's my wife.
Yep.
Former Congressman Jody Guardi. Nice to be here. I represented Westchester County, New York in the 80s. I think if we're going to look at trade, we have to look at peace and stability for Europe, the European Union. We have major problems. Turkey, Brexit, Russia. The biggest problem I think you're going to face, and Shirley and I work on this issue a lot, is the successful integration of Southeast Europe, mainly the Balkans, into the European Union. Because now you have Erdogan, and his election yesterday is really sending signals that are the wrong ones, that certainly the people in the United States don't understand this. And certainly to the Balkans, because he has visited Albania, Kosovo. He's trying to unsettle the Muslim population there. The most tolerant Muslim population you have are the people of the Albanians, 7 million.
Yeah.
They saved every Jew in World War II in Albania, and they wouldn't have had that many except they went through Kosovo, 3,000, to get to Albania. But if we don't look at the future of this part of Europe and understand that this instability is mounting. Serbia does not want to recognize Kosovo. Right off the bat, you don't have these two people acting as good neighbors. 5 European Union members don't want to recognize Kosovo, but 115 countries have recognized Kosovo. So now, this has to be resolved. Turkey is now meddling with not only the Balkans by trying to bring back the Ottoman Empire, it's now visiting Russia. And Russia has been trying to get a foothold in the Balkans for years because their Slavic cousins all live down there in Macedonia and in Serbia and in Montenegro. So you've got big problems besides Brexit there. I didn't hear Brexit once here, and I'm telling you that Brexit will be resolved somehow with rational people. But you've got a big problem now to integrate Southeast Europe into the European Union.
Okay, I saw, sir, you've had your hand up for a while, and then we'll take, and you had a question, and then I have to cut it off and see if we have more time, I'm sorry. Yes. Sir in the yellow tie?
Oh.
Yeah.
I'd given up, see, you gotta be.
You gotta have faith. All right, yes.
I would like the gentleman to opine a little bit on Brexit, and how
Okay.
they think it's going to be resolved, and how detrimental it is if they depart.
Okay. In the pinstripes?
Yeah. Ambassador Shower, what happened to the yellow canary Cadillac that you brought? If you could tell us. And just as a sidelight, this is from the Wall Street Journal in June 12th. Last year, the European had 151 billion trade surplus with the United States. China ran a 376 billion trade surplus with the United States, the largest in history. The world sold the United States 800 billion more in goods than we sold in the world. So just in defense of Trump, his position is that the United States continues to buy from others more than we sell, and I guess he's concerned that that's not the way to go. But the first question is more interesting to me.
We'll actually let you two have had your hands up, so we'll let you two ask your questions, then we'll try to get to what we can get to. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to raise the issue of the European data privacy regulation, because it's not explicitly trade, but it has enormous implications for trade, but also for security. From my point of view, it destroys our Patriot Act, so this is not a
Sorry?
Patriot.
data security, the EU privacy regulations.
Okay. And then finally, yes.
The Ernie Conyu, Silicon Valley, California. I got really upset at this example you used on religion, specifically on Islam. And it really, there is no danger of Islam, and therefore the folks who are worried about a migration-driven Islamic danger don't have anything to worry about. I happen to have been born in Hungary, and in 1525, the Hungarians lost a battle to the Turks, and who for 150 years, similar to what happened in Spain earlier, for 150 years, Turkey occupied Hungary, was freed by the Allied forces led by Austria. And what happened there was total cultural suppression through Sharia law. How much of a suppression? the church that I was baptized in Tamási, Hungary, was used as a stall for horses of the Yanichari soldiers of Turkey. The religion was driven underground, totally, by use of Sharia law. So you two European types from Western Europe who don't understand what Islam did in Hungary, even today, you don't understand why the Hungarian current constitution has in it the provision that it is a Christian country, specifically. That is something that sort of hurts my feelings.
Okay. Okay.
See if you can.
See if you can answer that one.
So we'll have that. So we have that. We have, is the EU coming together to tell the U.S. to share more of its burden on refugees? We have integration in the Balkans. We have Brexit. We have what happened to Ambassador Schubert's Cadillac. And we have data privacy regulation. What I will do, since we have 9 minutes, is sort of to fix all of that, I will let each of you take of that what you can and sort of make a closing statement, answer what you can in 4.5 minutes. We'll start with you.
Well, I will make one, and maybe try to wrap it up in some form of message, in the sense that, because different subjects have been touched upon, also geographically.
Yep.
That I think it is, we should not leave this room without saying that the international context, seen from the European point of view, encourages us, the Europeans, to at least have some form of unity, and they will have to try to find it themselves. I mean, if you look, there was a Brexit question, which is a terrible thing, is Brexit, and what we will have to learn on the European continent to adjust ourselves to a life without the UK as a member after 44 years. Tough adjustment. We've spoken about what's happening in the relationship with the United States. We haven't spoken about Russia, but it's clear that Russia is, I think, is probably, although we are geographically so close, and we would traditionally in Europe say we have to keep a dialogue open while doing all the deterrence we need. Today there is now the meddling in elections. There is we start to realize that if Putin wants to do something against the West, it's probably more on the European continent, because that's maybe where the West, he thinks, is weakest.
Including in the Balkans.
Including in the Balkans. Including in the Balkans. We have the stability question. I mean, it's in Southeast Europe. You're absolutely right. It's very clear, I think, that if they would have, these countries, a European roof above their head, that probably there would be a bit less instability, a bit more stability also for their democratic systems. I think that goes without saying. You look at China, where they've become, the leader has become much more assertive in developing or unrolling the Rust and Belt initiative, the Road and Belt initiative, in pushing it back against the United States when it comes to trade. South China Sea, Africa remains confronted with migration, development, demography, and so on. And for us, Latin America seems still a rather distant continent and a bit of an absent continent. So, but in that context, if we do not look for some unity ourselves, who will do it for us? So, my main message would be that one at this stage. And on the Brexit, I mean, the person who can predict how this will end is probably not very honest or convincing, because it is impossible at this stage to predict how this is going to end. Overall, we are still taking into account all possible scenarios, from the cliff edge to the no deal. We are very worried, as are the American companies who talk to us about this thing, about the disruption. The ports of Rotterdam, Zeebrugge, I mean, and we are starting to prepare ourselves, at least on the side of the continent, and I hope it will also be on the side of the UK, that there is a plan B for the case it doesn't, there's no deal. But I've been 25 years in European affairs, the Greek crisis, and I've at least 20 times heard this is the end, and this is not going to work, and Greece is why, and the European Union. And at the end of the day, there always was a kind of agreement. It was slow, and it was not very, it was cumbersome. But let's hope that for the different issues we've been discussing, migration and the trade issue, that at the end of the day we will also be able to produce the agreements that are probably needed to get things in the most positive way forward. Thank you very much.
Okay, Ambassador Schubert, over to you.
I think our segment was called The Future of Europe, which is already for us an enormous step up. Normally we are invited to explain the end of Europe to a room, so we're already starting at 50%. So thank you for that, and I hope that I can assure you that there is a future for Europe. I think we are doing, as Dirk has said, we are doing relatively well, and in a strange way, even Brexit has helped us to come together and to realize what we have. We are doing economically relatively well. My country, the Belgians, also we have a positive budget. We are doing okay. Secondly, the most important partner in all respects for the European Union is the US. Period. There is no other partner for us. You are the partner of choice. And if there is a worry in the EU, is that you, US, being in the middle and being as big and as unified as you are, you can go to the left and you can go to the right. You can go to Asia, you can go to the EU. I think we have to, like we did in the last 70 years, we have to make ourselves attractive and known to the US. We are still your favorite partner, and we should be, and that's what we as EU ambassadors also are trying to do, to basically explain to Congress and also to the administration that we are there, we are open for business, and we want to keep the business as it is, because it will be beneficial, very beneficial for all of us. Let me address your question specifically on the danger of Islam. There is nobody in the Netherlands, Islam or any other religion, who can come into the Netherlands and establish him or herself in the Netherlands without signing up to the rules that are in the Netherlands, to our constitution. Therefore, the idea that there would be a Sharia in the Netherlands is ludicrous. If you want to live in my country, you live by the rules of my country, and in exchange we will give you shelter, we will give you food, we will treat you as a citizen of the Netherlands, but the counterpart for your part is you live by my rules. And I think that is very, very important, and that goes for the whole of Europe. You can come to Europe, but you live by the rules that are in Europe, and I think that is essential for having a refugee policy or an immigration policy. You will not be allowed to change a country by coming into it in large numbers and changing the policy of the country. So I think that is very, very important. I don't think at the moment, for 2 or 3 specific questions, I don't think that we are looking at a burden sharing request towards the US at the moment. We have basically already talked to the US on various occasions on the refugee problem. I spoke to it very briefly earlier. I think it's time that there would be a worldwide, a global refugee conference where we try to discuss and tackle that refugee problem, and as Derek said, basically step in for those countries that are fragile countries as it is, like Lebanon, to basically help them to survive the refugee problem we have done. European data privacy, one comment, there is after 9/11, the United States went very much for homeland security and protecting the country. In Europe, we still have very much the idea of protecting the individual privacy. We were slowly growing towards each other up to 2 or 3 years ago. And then this privacy protection issue came up. We now have a privacy protection law which is signed off by the US and the EU together, which is being challenged in the court. That's a normal phenomenon, both here and in Europe, I can tell you. Everything goes to court immediately. That this will take a little while. The European Commission, and I can tell you my country and a number of other countries, still stand squarely behind the agreement that we have made with the United States about the privacy protection, the data protection directive. So I think we will hope that it will survive. And if not, you know what, it takes so long that if you see it will not survive, you make a different arrangement within the EU. So it is a problem, and it is a problem here. What do you value more, your homeland security or your individual privacy? We have to talk that over, but at the moment I don't see any real threat at the moment. And then lastly, the most important question,
yep.
my Cadillac. I sold my Cadillac after a year, and it was on the road for 10 more years, driven by a friend of mine who was very popular because he drove his daughter's hockey team from one match to another because it could at least have 10 girls in the Cadillac. So it had a long, long life afterwards.
All right, on that note, please join me in wishing that Belgium has continued success in the World Cup. And thanking my distinguished guests.